I was 5 years old when my grandmother first compared me to a murderer. I'd stretch my vocabulary to swear some oath of revenge against a schoolyard bully who'd wronged me, and then she said it, "You're just like Helen Jean." Helen Jean Stapleton was my grandmother's oldest sister, the eldest of three. She was dying at that very moment from terminal cancer in Texas, where the remainder of my southern relatives had migrated to from Harrison, Arkansas, a town lodged in the heart of the Ozarks Mountains, which was proudest around at the turn of the century for being the home of the Ku Klux Klan. The comparison to Helen Jean came with benign explanations when I was young. She was an Aquarius, and this was a fact that held stock with a grandmother who weekly read my horoscope to me from the back of her TV guide. And it followed naturally then that she could hold a grudge like an artist. It was her nature, and therefore it was mine. My grandmother's youngest sister, the little one of the three who'd been born too late to remember their father, she'd come out to San Diego from Texas for the holidays during those years. And the evenings remanded time for trading stories of Helen Jean's ingenious acts of retribution. Manic depression and other clinical condescensions come to our mind now, but the wisdom of the time was content not to cross the woman in any way, real or imagined, if it could be helped. The little one had made such a mistake some years prior, and Helen Jean had mailed back a box of her hair curlers she'd borrowed, every one of them deconstructed down to their singular parts. A process that could have only taken hours of diligent work, a marvel of dedication to the art of revenge. Now, these were appropriate anecdotes for a child to hear about the relative they were growing to resemble. I was over a decade older and Helen Jean dead for several years before the serious disclosures of her character came. My grandmother was a private woman. She'd grown up when dirty laundry wasn't aired, but her reticence went beyond that. Where others were content not to speak ill of the dead, she preferred not to invoke them at all. But those moments of familiarity I manufactured for her loosened her tongue. Helen Jean had been the only soul who knew the nature of the bad old days before the sisters had married into their respective escapes, back when they were known as the Stapletons. And I was a safe confidant, too young to know anyone she might mention, but still blood, and no one could tell my grandmother that the words she shared with me couldn't somehow travel back upstream to the sister she could no longer say them to. My grandmother's was a tormented childhood, dominated by a drunken and violent father, a beaten mother who'd found escape in the same whiskey that had blackened her eyes and cracked her ribs. The rules to their survival were brief and straightforward. When the father came home drunk, the mother told him to hide. The only space outside his reach was the crawl space beneath their house, in the dark and the damp among spiders and rusted nails, and there the girls would huddle through many a night until he fell asleep, a calm heralded by the quieting of the mother's screams and the terrible catharsis of the father retching up his poisons. But when no warning came before the father's wrath, Helen Jean would bear the brunt of it during waking hours, and at night she slept with a bat under her pillow, right beside my grandmother and the little one, with a promise to them for a lullaby that if he came in that room, she'd kill him. The mother stood up to the father on one notable occasion. He'd taken offense in his addled brain to the noise made by a litter of kittens their house cat had birthed some days prior, and he resolved it by breaking each of their necks. The mama cat running around her young, helpless, in hysterics, howling to what god animals call to, and the Stapleton girls just watched unwordless, wondering when he'd do the same to them. And when his work was done, the father propelled himself into his car and out into the night to continue his drinking in peace. But after the mother put the girls to bed, she spent the next hour lining the walkway leading to their front door with those bodies of those kittens on either side of their path so that he might be forced to see what he'd done on his return. She'd pay for it, but she reckoned it needed doing, and it gave her some satisfaction to know that what bruises would come for once came earned. Now, such spectacles informed as much of how the girls loved as how they learned to hate. Every stray cat or wandering possum found an oasis of food or care at the back doors of their respective homes right up until the day they died. And in a time and a community where outlawing animal abuse was regarded as ludicrous as penalizing domestic violence, their softness drew some ridicule, but their identical reply never wavered. Oh, they're just poor little creatures, don't know better why people be cruel to them, and they never asked for nothing. And then they'd leave explanations to that to go care for what they could. The Stapleton girls' time under the stairs likewise shaped their ways. Both my grandmother and Helen Jean shared a terror of creeping things and a claustrophobia so severe that they could not bear to be hugged without invoking the memory of their childhood enclosure. As where alcohol were concerned, my grandmother grew up a teetotaler. Helen Jean only drank for two reasons. One, to keep up with the men, and two, when she was angry. As a ritual to prepare for her coming retribution, but her enemies learned that way too late to save them. Now, the God of the Ozarks is a particular God. In his infinite miserly compassion for his people, he saw fit that Helen Jean never had to make good on her promise to kill her first tormentor. My great-grandfather died halfway through the windshield of his Model T, every tissue in his body soaked in the same rye that had ruined him, a pioneer, if you will, among drunk drivers. But were he a generous God, he would have seen fit to kill the father before Helen Jean went and married Kenneth Higginbottom in her desperation to escape. The Higginbottoms were a jet-eyed, black-haired people of the hills of a solemn disposition, and Kenneth their misbegotten moonshiner son. He was 10 years older than Helen Jean when they'd met and wed, but he was still a livelier example of their line than the rest. A good deal of fun when he had half a mind to be, but with his darker seasons came a temper, and once he'd sat on it long enough and had his bride locked under his surname, he allowed himself the indulgence of beating his wife. My grandmother and the little one married in kind and moved away to shortly thereafter, the former to California and the latter to Texas, leaving Helen Jean alone in the town of her birth to fend for herself. But the old women of Arkansas are strangers to complaint. They knew their God, and they accepted their life on his terms, such as they were. In her regular correspondence to my grandmother, Helen Jean never once bemoaned her fate or pled for help from her sister, never spoke of what went on behind closed doors at all, not even after the murder. The police had found her in the early morning, the winter of 1962, miles away from her land across snow-covered forest. She'd crossed barefoot in nothing but a shift. Her one phone call was used to call the little one, who began a journey of 2 days from Houston to Harrison, and there she found her eldest sister sitting in a jail cell without emotion, food refused, lips sealed, and covered in blood. The sisters spent hours together without speaking, the little one pulling thorns free from where they'd lodged in Helen Jean's feet and legs during her journey, but no registration of pain traveled up the body to the face. What happened, the little one finally asked when her work was done and the guards were away. No one will ever know what happened that night, Helen Jean answered. But if you're asking, I'm glad the bastard's dead. My grandmother had arrived during this time when bail was posted, and she was first into Helen Jean's house once the police allowed it. And what she found there was impossible. A litter of dead puppies leading up the way to the front door. A Christmas Eve feast sat untouched on the dining room table a week after it had been prepared. And oddly least disturbing of all, in the bedroom dried the stains of what was Kenneth Higginbottom. It was all there as it had been on the night of the murder, minus his corpse. And my grandmother knew it at once for what it was, a stage built out of last straws, a recreation of childhood horrors by the knowing perfection of some divine hand. The table was set with turkey, yams, cranberries, mashed potatoes, cornbread, green bean casserole, pies, and all for a husband who'd come home drunk on Christmas Eve. They'd had a fight, and not content to bash her face on the Lord's birthday, Kenneth had marched outside to where his wife's dog had given birth some days prior. And there, in that dark country where the people learned to stop praying to save their voices from screaming, the God of the Ozarks set him about to breaking those puppies' necks, one by one, while that bitch hound howled. And Helen Jean stood in that doorway watching more than Kenneth would ever know, silent in a way that deflated his victory, silent in a way that sent him out into the night where he might find others to be with. And she watched him go until no light from his car remained and the darkness was final. And then Helen Jean began drinking. She caught up a bottle of White Lightning she'd hid from her husband, sat down among the whimpering dog and licking the puppies who were growing cold in spite of her. She sat in the dirt and she drank. Kenneth returned hours later, walking blind past her and his handiwork without comment to the bedroom, where his strength finally buckled and he blacked out on the mattress, and Helen Jean remained in the dirt with her drink and her dead and her memories until she could hear the sounds of her husband snoring, calling out to her from inside the house. And only then did she trace his footsteps inside, detouring briefly to the closet to load their 12-gauge shotgun, before turning into the threshold of their room and firing every shell it held into his silhouette. Helen Jean answered the dry click of an empty barrel by reloading and then detonating its cartridges again and then again until every conceivable part of what was Kenneth Higginbottom was separated from the other. It was surmised that Helen Jean threw the gun down the outhouse where it could rest under years of shit, down in a blackness no simple country lawman could bring himself to reach, and where it was never found. And then she just started walking. Helen Jean's was a hanging trial. Higginbottoms, they sat in the courtroom throughout to intimidate judge, jury, defendant with their black eyes and the certainty that somebody was going to die for their kin, whether the law had anything to say about it or not. But the Stapleton girls never quit blood. They posted bail. They hired the wiliest fox of a country lawyer they could find, and they did for a sister what they do when they have a family and not much else. They bribed the judge. There was no forensics in 1962 that Harrison, Arkansas's police had much access to. No murder weapon, and a suspect who never spoke a word to anyone. The Stapletons also had a granddaddy, a great-granddaddy, who'd been a judge in that country some years prior. He was a cold old man with a little bit of Indian in him, but he was respected and known. And what's more, they had some money between them. Not a lot, but enough to make a small-town country judge's bounty runneth over for a time. And so the trial fell apart. Helen Jean was freed. The Higginbottoms threatened a lynching, but she was long gone before they came for her. She was absconded to Texas City so she could live near the little one. And there, Helen Jean got herself a job as a cleaning lady to make ends meet in a courthouse, of all places. She made a point to scrub out the judge's coffee mug whenever he pissed her off, but other than that, she lived her life without incident. Never remarrying, and alone, except for the dog who'd outlived its get. But there was one known exception to this epitaph. See, one afternoon some years later, a group of high school boys became mistaken. They started throwing rocks at Helen Jean's dog in the front yard, and the dog was old and sickly by then, and it took what strength that the poor thing had to crawl up the stoop and hide behind Helen Jean, who'd come out to meet them with her brand new 12-gauge shotgun. "You boys want to have a shooting match?" she called. No, they did not. In fact, they ran away to grow up wiser than they'd been in their youth. And all of this, Helen Jean related to my grandmother with great pride to my grandmother, one of her famous letters. Oh. What beast would torment a life that don't know why better people be cruel to it? They're just poor little creatures would never ask for nothing.